Welcome to an unabridged free audio story reading of The Assurance Salesman, a short story by R.J. Sullivan, read by Danielle Muething, as presented in the collection Darkness with a Chance of Whimsy. Shadows flicker across the walls of the train, visiting spirits peeking in on the doings of the living. All is silent except for the steady churning of the train wheels, the grinding rhythm echoing in the ears of the 5 travelers seated in the car. The passengers stare in a dazed stupor, lulled by the train, content in their own space with their own thoughts. On one side of the car, bodies entwined, are the newlyweds, Janet and Kevin McConnell. He stares at some fixed point on the wall while cradling her in his arms. She is the only one comfortable enough to actually doze, finding solace with her husband, her blonde head nestling against his shoulder. On the same bench as the newlyweds, Mr. Stuart Collins, an elderly, distinguished gentleman, dressed in black formal wear, pats the knee of his wife, Lucy. Even with an obvious layer of makeup hiding the wrinkles around her eyes and a stylish emerald hat covering most of her auburn hair, Lucy Collins still has the ability to turn heads. They sit with their backs straightened in perfect upper-class grace. The 5th passenger, Gary Finn, reclines alone on the bench across from them. His young face turns toward the window, even though it's too dark to see outside. Gary clutches his heavy brown jacket, having found it an inadequate pillow. In spite of his frequent business trips, Gary had long ago found it impossible to sleep on a train. After a month on the road, parted from April, his beloved wife of 7 years, his mind simply races. Soon he will be home again. When he arrives, he will undress and crawl into bed beside his wife's slumbering form. And with the warmth of her body next to his, he will finally slip into a sound sleep. Knowing she is once more next to him, he will dream, something he has not done in 30 days. Gary looks over at Kevin, acknowledging him with a slight nod. He's envious of Kevin's apparent comfort. He observes that Janet has no problem relaxing on a train, her chest moving slowly with her even breathing. In, out, in. Gary catches himself staring and, embarrassed, glances back over at Kevin. He doesn't seem to notice. Mr. Collins stirs and reaches for his pocket watch, solid gold. He bragged about it hours earlier when they were still talking, when sunbeams shone through the windows, reflecting off the pale maple insets of the car's interior, flooding the confined space with light. Those same surfaces now reflect monochromatic moonlight, whitewashing all detail from the room. Not that anyone cares anymore. Click. The lid opens. Stuart groans, snaps the watch closed, rubs his tired eyes, and shakes his head. Gary dares a whisper. "What time is it?" "3. We should be in London in another 2 hours. 2 hours, Gary thinks. 2 more hours of shadows, of being lulled by the chugging of the train, of small dozes, of not quite falling asleep as the train beats out the rhythm of a false lullaby. Momentary light catches the clear plastic-coated sign hanging on the wall over Gary's shoulder, an ad he'd read hours ago, can't see now, and doesn't particularly remember. For a microsecond, he sees Janet's pale face and blonde tresses framed in a rectangle of ghostly illumination. Janet grunts, her head jerks, and her eyes snap open, fully awake. Gary smiles at her. "I hate when that happens." His voice sounds hollow and distant in his own ears. "I can never sleep on these damn things either." Kevin's arm tightens on her shoulder. She grips his other hand, her eyes close, and her face relaxes into a look of ecstasy. As he has done countless times tonight, Gary reaches into the folds of his jacket and pulls out the picture from a hidden pocket. He can't clearly see the image anymore. The soft brunette curls, pouting lips, the pink chiffon dress she wore especially for the occasion. His fingers trail across the cheap frame of beaten plastic anyway. He has kept her memory in tight rein for so long. It's a game of discipline he plays with himself. When he has to travel, he simply puts the photo away, along with all thoughts of her. It lessens the longing during the days, but not the nights, when her disembodied voice speaks to him over the phone, for he calls her every evening without fail. He dreads the word goodbye when he must hang up the receiver and face the specter of her memory as he lies alone in his quiet hotel room. As usual, he never looks at the picture the entire trip. As usual, in the last 12 hours, he can't put it down. The older man, Mr. Collins, speaks. "Nothing like returning to the woman you love." He smiles from across the compartment and places his hand on his wife's knee. "I remember when I'd have to be gone, sometimes 2 months at a time. There'd be my Lucy, standing in the doorway with a martini and a smile. And that was all." "Stuart." She tries to sound shocked, but she's too tired. Stuart's laughter lightens up the dreary mood of the train. Gary, embarrassed, slides the photo back into the pocket of his bundled jacket. It's not the going home I mind. It's the wait. The outside door opens. A cold wind gusts through the outer hall and into the compartment. Lucy starts and grabs at her hat. Janet sits upright, gripping Kevin's arm. A bulky mass wrapped in a black fluttering cloth jumps into the room, turns, and struggles with the door behind him. Gary clutches his coat tighter. Black-gloved hands grip the door handle and pull. A protest of metal. The door slams shut. A man enveloped in a dark, billowing trench coat stands in the middle of the room, looking around the small compartment. The room echoes with the stranger's harsh breathing. Every feature of his face is covered by the shadow of a large top hat. Gary waits in expectation, not daring to breathe. The stranger speaks. "Excuse me." His voice rumbles, a sound that bounces off the walls. The shadow spirits seem to flee for an instant, returning only reluctantly to eye this newcomer. The stranger reaches up and removes the hat, exposing a layer of dark, wavy hair. His sallow skin and thin, youthful face stand in sharp contrast to his dark, piercing eyes, which gaze about the room at each passenger in turn. Janet squirms as his stare falls upon her. "My apologies. I did not mean to awaken anyone. I tried to sleep in the other car, but—" He trails off. The stranger shrugs, and the coat shifts. A quick lift and toss of his hand, and the top hat sails into the upper compartment. Slowly, the stranger turns. He claims the empty space next to Gary and smiles at each passenger. They all remain silent. Frequent travelers know that cliques formed at the beginning of long journeys are sacred for the duration. For many hours, this group has formed such a comradeship. The man had no part in that bonding, making him unwelcome. The shadows dominate the room. They flicker, glide from corner to corner, across the weary faces. To Gary, the pulse of the train is louder now, weighing him down and pounding in his head. Or maybe it's the way the stranger keeps looking at him, a queer half-smile on his face. The dark gaze travels from one person to the other. Gary takes up the thread of the previous conversation. "Yes, Mr. Collins." To him, his voice sounds shaky, an imitation of his drowsed stupor moments before. He senses a whiny hint of anxiety in it, a desperation to clear the chill. I'm sure April will be waiting for me when I get home, though at... His voice fails entirely, then starts back up again. At 6 a.m, I doubt she'll have any ideas like that. Stuart looks confused, as if he has forgotten the previous conversation. Then, as it all comes back to him, he smiles again. I suspect you'll have to wait till this evening for the real welcome home. Oh, I rather think not. Gary cradles the jacket in his arms. Thinking of April, his trembling stills. The stranger's intrusion is forgotten with his silence. Right now, the best welcome home I can get would be for the two of us to drift off to sleep together. That's what I want. Those moments are always nice too, Stuart says. Gets the strength back up for the next time we can... Stuart! Lucy elbows her husband, which seems to be about the only thing she's done the entire trip. Your lechery is becoming tiresome, she scolds. These young people have no interest in the bedroom habits of an old man. Stuart grunts, but holds back a reply. Janet speaks in a timid voice from her corner of the car. You like the tender moments, too. Her eyes are half open, her cheek once again tucked against the warmth of her husband's shoulder. Her hand strokes Kevin's fingers. His face comes to life. He looks down at her, attentive to her expression, her words, everything about her. Janet beams at her husband. Moments like this, him and me, just being with him, and I'm in heaven. Gary flushes, uncomfortable at this public proclamation of love. Kevin seems just as stunned, and leans down toward her. His lips graze her forehead. Gary averts his eyes, letting them have their moment. His gaze falls upon the stranger. What right does the man have to be here and witness this display with the others, those who had talked with Kevin and Janet and developed a respect for their relationship? The stranger continues to watch, unmoving, with no regard for his invasiveness. Such a lovely display. Sarcasm peppers the stranger's words. I wonder if they, or you, understand anything about true love. Nobody moves. The moment lingers. Gary shifts uneasily, wondering if the man is talking to him. He turns to the stranger. I beg your pardon? A disarming smile crosses the stranger's face, taking the sting from his remark. What I mean is, perhaps they don't understand how love works. He raises a hand. I mean no offense, merely a speculation. Gary blinks rapidly in the dark, floundering, compelled to defend the young couple. Your speculation confuses me. You have me at a disadvantage. The stranger motions with his gloved hands to indicate the other passengers. Imagine love as a multi-headed serpent. The newlyweds here are familiar with one aspect, but other levels linger beyond their ability to perceive. Gary's anger flares, but dissipates just as fast. The stranger leans forward on the bench, reining in his audience as he places his elbows on his knees and folds his gloved hands together. He looks relaxed, comfortable in the spotlight. Gary rises to the man's challenge. I don't think that you... I'm merely trying to come up with an answer to your confusion. I'm suggesting that it's possible that this intense passion your young friends feel isn't love at all. Janet's face turns a deep shade of red. She sits up, pulling out of the cocoon of Kevin's arms. If you're to dazzle me with your wit and pseudo-philosophy, I'm not impressed. How dare you presume to tell me my feelings for my husband, as if you had any idea how I might feel? The words hang in the air, trapped in the confines of the car. Gary turns to face the stranger. Odd, he thinks, how the stranger's eyes appear so blue up close, yet so dark from a distance. The stranger settles back on the seat, not quite as confident. One hand reaches into a pocket of his coat as he speaks. Please, hear me out. The stranger meets Janet's glare. You're right, Janet. That was a stupid thing to say, and you're correct to be insulted. Gary sees her eyes widen at the stranger's use of her familiar name. He can't recall anyone saying it since the stranger entered the car. But then, the conversation has taken such an odd turn, he can't be sure. The stranger turns toward Janet. His question shoots across the compartment. Janet, do you love Kevin? She jumps in her seat. What? Yes. Are you sure? Yes, absolutely. Kevin's arm tightens around her. Does he love you? I know he does. Do you? You know this for a fact. Yes. A grimace of impatience crosses her face, briefly smudging her pale beauty, but she cannot turn away. I know he loves me. He doesn't need to convince me of that. Both of her hands grip her husband's. How? Have you developed some way to get inside his head? I feel... She stops, groping for the words. Different with him than I have with anyone else, unlike I've ever felt before. Ah. The stranger nods his head. I see. But that's the real dilemma, isn't it? Your proof is based on feeling. You don't mean you're truly linked to him in some psychic manner, do you? Janet's brows furrow. Well, no, not literally. The stranger pauses, leaning forward. Your proof of his love is based on your own feelings, not his. You know nothing for certain. Janet trembles. Well, I suppose you're right, but that's all anyone can possibly... She stops in mid-sentence, unable to continue. Her eyes tear up. Kevin glares at the stranger. Gary tenses. He wishes the man would leave the compartment and just go away. Kevin pulls her close. I think you've said more than enough. There's a hostile edge to his voice. The stranger refuses to back down. Why? Are you afraid of what I'm proposing? Think about it for just a second. Maybe Janet only thinks she loves you. I rather think her reaction here proves her love. Not that she ever had to. And if it weren't for her interest, I'd have thrown you out of here. Yes, she is awfully upset. Maybe because she realizes I could be right. Before Kevin can reply, the stranger turns toward Gary. And you, young man, what about the woman waiting for you? Don't start on April. I know she loves me. Do you? Yes. The stranger smiles again. So sure of yourself. Gary's thoughts spin in confusion. All right, damn you, I get your point. No, I can't get into my wife's head. I don't know with absolute, 100% certainty that she's as in love with me as I am with her. But she shows all the signs to me. She tells me she loves me, and she acts as if she loves me. I have faith in that. Ah, well, that may be good enough for you. But what if you could rely on something more certain? With that, he withdraws his hand from the coat pocket, clutching a small object. Janet and Gary watch, their eyes locking onto the blue-colored rose in his hand. Sculpted of transparent crystal, the petals surround a glowing blue sphere. The rose itself would be enough to capture anyone's attention, but the sphere within glimmers with an inner beauty that brightens the entire car. The shadows dissolve in the overpowering light. "What's that?" Janet whispers, as the stranger extends the crystal in front of her pale face. Lucy Collins also leans forward. "Ah, it glitters," says the stranger. "You see how we suddenly have the girl's attention." The stranger settles back, allowing the fist-sized object to remain exposed in his hand, gripping it by its curved silver stem so that all in the car can see it. Gary sees the transparent center of the rose cloud with swirling blue smoke. The stranger shrugs. "This little beauty, diamond, crystal, charm, I don't really know what, is rather special. It took away all my doubts about love." His eyes harden. "It's also why I'm currently without companionship." They all wait. The stranger delights in the moment, letting it linger before continuing. "You see, this rose is magical. I don't understand how it works. I only know that it does. I found it on a train rather similar to this one, under a seat, and I was ready to give it to the station master when I accidentally discovered its powers." "A charlatan!" Stewart speaks, shaking his head. "You're a con artist. I should have known better." "Oh no. No gimmick here, although I'm sure you'll think so at first. You see, somehow, the crystal center can tap into the mind's eye of another person. I don't pretend to understand magic. Imagine, though, an object that can read your mind, find out who you love, and present you with an image of yourself from that person's frame of mind." He extends the glowing blue rose, tantalizingly, in front of Janet's widened eyes. As it inches nearer, she bites her lip. There is a loud chuckle from Stewart's corner. "Of course! And how much do you ask for this miracle?" £50 for one gaze. Gary's excitement dampens at the offer. "That's ridiculous, for a silly parlot trick." But his voice cracks, exposing his lack of conviction. "I'm sure it makes you feel better to keep insisting that, and I can even see where you're coming from, which is why—" The stranger spaces his words carefully, aiming them directly at the transfixed woman. "Janet can have a free look. Once you've accepted her word for it, I'll take your £50 each in turn." "Really?" Gary says feebly. "And what makes you think it's really worth £50? £50 to know the unknowable, to make faith fact. Isn't that worth £50 to you?" Janet's hands are already clasped around the folded petals, which direct the light to make her face shine an eerie blue. She looks at the stranger uncertainly. "What do I do?" The stranger releases the rose into her hands. As she leans away from him, the stranger blends into the darkness. "Close one eye and focus directly into the center. Don't worry about light. It works even in total darkness. The image will be perfect." Janet holds the rose close. The stem burns against her trembling fingers. She needs both hands to steady the crystal. She can see the center, not simply clouded, but filled with smoky, animated, swirling mist. An actual light of unknown nature within the rose causes the blue glow. She hardly has time to reflect on this when the mist clears and she finds herself staring at an image of herself. She is seated in the train, as she was moments earlier, leaning against her husband's shoulder. Only Kevin is not in the picture, at least, not his face. Her breath leaves her body as she realizes that she is seeing through Kevin's eyes, looking down on his new bride. She can see her own face from his viewpoint. She remembers the daily routine of seeing her own face in a mirror, angry at the puffiness of her cheeks, at the way her hair would never settle quite right. In the rose, the flaws remain, but are filtered to the point of insignificance. She sees herself, all the features the same, but there is an image, a golden glow over her face and body that is almost angelic. A finger caresses her cheek, and the skin, her skin, feels like the softest, smoothest, most beautiful silk she has ever touched. Images superimpose themselves rapidly over her body. She can see herself in her nightgown on their wedding night, a sense of pleasure mixed perfectly with tenderness. Purity and passion somehow become one and the same, and she is the source. She tries to force the flaws she sees in herself, the hair, the weight, the temper tantrums. They don't exist in this image. She sees herself, but now she is his perfect woman. Sexy, funny, beautiful, giving, everything. The rose drops from her hands into the stranger's. She buries herself in Kevin's arms, the joy in her sobs tearing from her. I love you, oh God, how I love you. Her arms squeeze her husband's shoulders as she cries. There's no shame left, nothing to hold back, not now and not ever again. Her sobs soon reduce themselves to gentle sniffs. The rest wait in an uneasy silence. Gary chokes up, both over her delirious happiness and at the vulnerability paired with it. Janet's voice is barely a whisper in Kevin's shoulder. I'm sorry. I should never, ever have doubted you. I just got so confused. I knew you loved me. I did, and I love you so much. But I didn't know you saw me like that. I don't deserve it. Kevin hushes her softly. It's okay. I know, love. It's okay. He murmurs to her until she quiets down. Well, says the stranger, his fingers stroking the petals like a pet rabbit. I trust there's no doubt as to the authenticity of the view. He looks over at Stuart, whose face is pale from Janet's display. Do you still deny the powers of the crystal, Mr. Collins? It's a trick. It has to be. His gaze remains on Janet, her shaking frame cradled in Kevin's arms. Perhaps you would suggest that the young lady and myself planned this ahead of time to succor you? Do you believe her capable of that? Janet sits up. No, I didn't, she explodes. I've never seen this man before in my life, I swear. It's okay, Stuart says. But Gary hears the uncertainty in Stuart's voice and sees the slight trembling in Stuart's hands. Stuart reaches toward the rose. It's a trick, maybe with mirrors. The stranger pulls the object away. Cost you £50 to find out. This time, Gary has no doubt he sees the stranger's eyes flash from black to an eerie blue, the same blue as the rose. The stranger's voice takes on a chastising tone. This is not a charity, Mr. Collins. I give out one free demonstration. I certainly won't make an exception for somebody I know damn well can afford it. Grudgingly, Stuart reaches into his pocket and begins shuffling through some bills. Lucy watches his actions, wide-eyed. What on earth do you think you're doing? Her voice is little more than a whisper, but more powerful than the loudest scream. You get this conditionally, Stuart says. His mouth curls down in a scowl. Only if I'm unable to find a sign of deception. The stranger nods. You are an educated man. Your word should have more than a little power on the others. His blue eyes peer at Gary, then look back. Perhaps Mr. Finn can hold the money. He can be trusted. Gary starts, suspicious of how the stranger could have come to such a conclusion. Agreed. Stuart extends the bills in Gary's direction. Gary grabs the money without taking his eyes from the stranger. Then he sees it. When the rose changes hands, the stranger's eyes darken. In fact, the stranger's entire form seems to fade. Lucy places her hand on Stuart's arm. "Stuart, wait! This is silly!" The rose glows brightly in Stuart's hands. When he turns to look at her, his face is a blue sheen of light. "What's silly about it, my dear?" "I'm just saying, it's a stunt. I didn't want you spending money foolishly." Stuart shrugs. "It's already done, dearest one. A gentleman's word and all that." "Stuart, don't." He focuses his eyes on the blue glowing center. "Stuart! Stuart, stop!" The mist parts. Stuart faces an old man with sad brown eyes, slightly resembling himself, but stooped. He hobbles across a large living room, money hanging out of his pocket. As he watches, a ravishing young woman dances across the floor, her long auburn hair flying as she turns. As she waltzes by, her hand snatches a 50-pound note. The old man keeps walking. He doesn't seem to notice. The image dissolves to another room. Stuart recognizes their bedroom. The old man is adjusting his tie in the mirror. Lucy, actually a woman of startling beauty, who bears little resemblance to the real Lucy, lies in the bed, talking about the next cocktail party. A ghostly image is superimposed over his face as the scene continues. Now the tie becomes a blindfold, covering the old man's eyes. Stuart can see the young woman in bed. Somebody else is with her. He has red hair and dark eyes. They are under the covers, kissing and laughing. She pulls him on top of her. The laughter stops. There are other sounds, of a more primitive nature. The figures are locked in an embrace. She rolls on top of him, but he now has a different face, blonde hair and blue eyes. She points at the blind old fool and laughs, a hoarse, cackling sound of mockery. Her lover fingers a string of beads around the woman's neck. A birthday gift from the old man, she says, and worth a lot of money, too. They fall against the mattress, ready to finish, but now the lover sports a beard and displays a tattoo on his left shoulder. "Mr. Collins!" He jumps. The stranger leans in front of him. His dark eyes, which earlier appeared greedy, now register concern and compassion. Stuart realizes that everyone is staring at him. The sound of the train beats through the walls as the seconds tick by. The stranger's hand grips Stuart's arm on the other side, nails cutting. "You've been staring into space for nearly 30 seconds, the stranger whispers, taking back the rose. "What did you see, darling?" Stuart hears the voice of the woman who talked of her expensive necklace. "Stuart? Darling? What's wrong? What did you—" Stuart jerks his arm. He pulls away, but then stabs a finger in front of her face. "Enough! Don't say another word. I know more about you than I ever bargained for, and nothing you can say will change that now." She shrinks back. She tries to speak, but he stops her with a look. He swallows and stands. The stranger rises to his feet, anxious and waiting. Stuart stands to his full height, straight and tall. He blinks away tears. He has never stooped. He is not yet old, but he's been blind. He takes a couple of steps toward the door. He will not stoop now, either. "Stuart." Gary also rises, placing a hand on Stuart's shoulder. Stuart can read the compassion on Gary's face. "I thought, if you wanted, I could help you." "No." Stuart's voice sounds quiet in his own ears. He draws a deep breath to put power behind his next words. "No, for a while at least, I am going to be alone." His hand clasps Gary's arm. moved by the concern the young man shows him.
"But only for a little while."
"Stuart,"
Lucy speaks from the corner.
"Whatever you saw, it was a trick, remember? You were going to prove it was wrong."
Tears well up in her eyes.
"It was wrong. It has to be."
Stuart releases Gary's arm and twists the handle of the door. His eyes travel the room one last time, lingering for a few moments on the stranger.
"Gary, pay the man."
Lucy cries, slumped against the now closed door as the shadows take inventory, unnoticed. The missing presence is felt by all. No one dares look at the sniffling figure. No one, save the stranger. Lucy feels his gaze drilling into her. She turns to him in fury.
"Damn you! Damn you and your magic! You had no right to come here and ruin my life like you have. How dare you!"
She screams, leaping to her feet. She swings at him, her clawed fingers cutting the air toward his face. He catches her wrist in mid-swing, holding it there. His gaze never wavers as he speaks. The words fly at her like daggers.
"No, how dare you? You could have had any rich man who's looking for a sick woman just like you. Someone to bury in diamonds and furs for the rest of his life, as long as you share your bed with him. Why did you have to pick one who actually loved you?"
Her mouth is open in outrage.
I only hope, after this is over, Mr. Collins doesn't give up on love, as those men have."
She pulls her hand free, adjusts her hat, and gathers up her imagined dignity.
"I have to go talk to him."
"Yes, you do."
The stranger turns and crosses the room to his space next to Gary.
"Perhaps you can convince him to let you keep the Rolls Royce."
She opens the door in a huff. The wind cuts in. Nobody moves. No sympathetic faces turn in her direction. The door shuts with a staccato slam. Silence permeates the cabin. Even the stranger seems at a loss for words. Gary pulls at a loose string on his jacket, waiting. The stranger's hand comes down on the pile of bills in Gary's lap. Gary notes the blue color in the stranger's eyes, but lets the stranger take the money without comment. When Gary looks over, he sees that Janet and Kevin are staring at him. He shifts uncomfortably in his seat. There is movement, and he knows the stranger is near. He does not turn to face him.
"Mr. Finn."
No. Gary shakes his head, trembling. He looks back toward the closed door. He draws his knees up and continues to shake his head.
I don't want to know. I don't. Just leave me alone."
The stranger nods and waits. The blue light from the rose pulses across his face. Gary shivers, but it is not from the cold. Janet sits up straight. Kevin's hand weaves through her hair. Gary can barely make out a tear trickling down Janet's face. The light from the rose glows even brighter now. The stranger says nothing. Why won't he say something, Gary wonders. Why won't he agree, or disagree, or talk about something else? Gary rummages through his jacket, darting his hand in and out of the pockets. He withdraws the money with trembling fingers. The picture slides out with it. He realizes, with both anger and relief, that he is short the needed money. He puts the money in his lap, stroking the picture.
"April," he speaks out loud. "You love me. I know you do."
He can see the outline of her smiling face, pink chiffon. His eyes lock with the stranger's defiantly.
"Well, she does."
Defensively.
"She does."
Desperately.
"Doesn't she? I only have £30, he says.
The stranger's eyes harden at the news, his gaze falling upon the crystal rose in his hand. Gary wonders if the stranger will slip the rose back into his coat pocket. Making his decision, the stranger takes the money from Gary's lap. "It will suffice, Mr. Finn, even for a prize such as this. I cannot take what you cannot give." He extends the rose and one note. "The bargain is sealed at £20, should you decide you would rather eat alone this morning after you've seen the truth." Gary says nothing, realizing the cynical reason behind the salesman's gift. The stranger expects an unpleasant outcome for him. The money is in the stranger's hand, and the rose is in Gary's. His breath comes in sharp jerks. He licks his lips, looking around the room. Janet averts her eyes, burying her face in Kevin's shoulder. Kevin shrugs helplessly. The stranger nods. The shadows wait. The petals surround a center that now burns brightly in his vision. The mist parts. For many seconds there is nothing but solid blue. Then the light dims to complete darkness. Almost. Except a single candle lights the room. The orange flame flickers from a slight wind. There is a woman, lying across cushions. Pillows! It is a bed. Their bedroom, in their flat. The image closes in. He sees his wife, April, lying awake on the bed and staring at the flame. The clock on the night desk reads 4:07. This is right now, the early morning, and she's awake. His own thoughts interject, reacting to the strangeness of the vision. April is always asleep when I come home. Or is she? But here she is now, awake, nervous, even desperate. He can feel that her stomach has knotted. He experiences the fluttering as if it were his own, magnified by sudden distress. "I've made up my mind. I'm telling him tonight. I can't bear keeping this secret any longer, and it is far past time he knew. I'll tell him as soon as he gets home. It's time Gary knows that I've gone to see him." A flush of fury pours over Gary. He almost pulls the crystal away, wanting to bury the truth, but the furious, betrayed part of him wants to know the rest. April continues her internal monologue, unaware of the trespasser into her deepest thoughts. "In a little over an hour, my secret will be out. Amazing how quickly the time has gone. Gary's called every night, and I just couldn't tell him. You don't break this kind of news to someone over the phone. It's not right. And as soon as he walks through that door, I'll tell him. I just don't know how he'll act. He may even be upset at first." At first, Gary thinks. Again, a fluttering response in her gut. A nervous reaction so painful that she reaches down and strokes a hand across her stomach. No, not her stomach, her abdomen. And then, in her internal monologue, she speaks to her abdomen. "Calm down, little one. Daddy will be home soon, and then we'll tell him all about our trip to the doctor. And won't he be so surprised?" And with that, she curls herself up against the bed, overwhelmed by simultaneous joy and sorrow. Alone, she cries out once again to her missing husband, needing the other half of herself, who is always so strong for her, as she tries to be strong for him as well, knowing when they separate, it's never by choice, but simply what he must do. Truthfully, he has always provided rather well for them, and they have always taken full advantage, having good time after good time. Because of those great joys, she puts on her happy face when he leaves, when she must endure living in a daze, a half-stupor. She knows without the slightest doubt that he will always return, no matter where his travels take him or how long they must endure their parting. He always returns. She can rely on that, just as he can rely on her being here, waiting for him. It is the foundation of their bond these last 7 years. Most burning passions cool after a few years, but theirs has never burned out. Never. And added to that heat over the years is something more precious than any lost desire: complete and total trust. April caresses her abdomen. Her pregnancy, already 2 months along, was discovered only a couple of days after he left.
"It's been too long. He will know tonight."
She knows that the news will shock him, reel him for just a moment, until he realizes that they will face this as they have all things, together, supporting each other in all ways. He can count on it. It's just going to be a rocky few minutes. She picks the clock up.
"He'll be coming home soon, little one. Daddy will be coming home soon."
The rose drops into his lap. He senses that the others, his companions, are on the edge of their seats. He blinks away tears, realizing for the first time that he is crying. Janet watches, biting her lip. Gary tries to say something, anything, but no words come. He has said nothing for many moments. The others are waiting for him to speak. Janet particularly looks distressed.
I'm going to be a daddy,"
is all he can manage to say. It is enough. Janet squeals with joy. Kevin laughs, and the stranger's hand clasps against his shoulder. And as the weight of the emotional exhaustion settles over him, Gary decides that he has paid enough for the privilege of his own private vision. He will keep the rest to himself.
"I am happy for you,"
the stranger says, slipping the rose into the pocket of his trench coat. Gary nods, saying nothing. The stranger prompts him.
"Please speak. I am curious to know what is going through your mind."
Gary shakes his head, as if waking from a dream. He rubs his eyes and blinks. He looks at the stranger.
"I know what love is," he says. "I always did."
The stranger nods.
"Yes, I suppose you did."
Gary chuckles, thinking back to when it all started. It seems years ago.
"And I can support what I said earlier.
Love is based on faith. I didn't need that rose. Without it, I'd still be in love. I'd still be happy." The stranger says nothing for a moment. Then he laughs, loudly, madly. Gary shifts uncomfortably in his seat. The stranger stands, still shaking his head.
"Faith? You think what you have now is faith?"
"Before you ever stepped in here, I had faith in April," Gary insists.
"If I had never met you, it would still be just as strong, with or without the rose." "Of course you had faith."
The stranger nods in agreement, and then his finger raises with the word.
"But you had faith because that was all you could have. When I entered, it was the first time you were aware that love could be proven."
The stranger's hand reaches up over the railing. He retrieves his hat.
"Now, you answer me this. Was there any one couple here that refused to look at the rose? Did anybody here say, 'No, thank you, sir, I have no need for your magic. I know the truth without it'?"
Gary opens his mouth to speak. The stranger cuts in.
"With conviction, Mr. Finn."
Gary stops, his train of thought broken. The stranger grasps the door handle.
"I've seen this over and over again. Janet was offered a free look. She took it without hesitation. Mr. Collins discovered firsthand the negative side of trading faith for fact. And I even got £20 from you, Mr. Finn."
Gary bristles.
"So what does that prove? You gave us an opportunity to invade our lovers' innermost thoughts. You speak of faith as if it's a bad thing, and offer your crystal rose as a sort of final answer to love.
It's no such thing." The stranger pauses in his action, leaning toward Gary. "Isn't it?" "Of course not," Gary scoffs. "What have you proven? True love is not a single state of mind frozen forever throughout time. 10 years ago, my passion for April undoubtedly matched that of Kevin's for Janet. And 10 years from now, in spite of my best efforts, I could end up like Stuart tonight." As if to dismiss the stranger, Gary turns from him. "What assurance have you truly offered me? A few months? A few weeks? Maybe only a day. Beyond that, I must again rely on my devotion to April and hers to me to get us through. And the vision I've seen here tonight will mean nothing." Gary risks a glance toward the door. Their eyes meet. No longer tapping into the power of the crystal, the stranger's face once again appears pale, with dark, sunken eyes. Gary knows what price he and his fellow passengers paid this evening. Now he ponders what price the stranger must pay to possess such dark magic. The shoulders of the stranger's trench coat rise and fall in a dramatic shrug. "Maybe you're right, Mr. Finn." An odd flickering of shadow and light passes over the stranger's face. He pulls upon the door latch, which clicks noisily as it comes loose. The stranger flashes his charming smile. "Then again, maybe you're not. Have a good evening, all of you." And he is gone, off to the next car, leaving the 3 remaining passengers to the mercy of the flickering shadows and the privacy of their own thoughts. We hope you enjoyed The Assurance Salesman, an unabridged free audio story read by Danielle Muething, and part of the short story collection Darkness with a Chance of Whimsy by R.J. Sullivan. To find more stories by R.J. Sullivan, including audiobook titles read by Danielle Muething, visit rjsullivanfiction.com.